I love Donald Fagen's 1982 album, The Nightfly. It's a perfect example of wonderfully written songs meeting crafty storytelling and near perfect audio sound quality. And the musicianship that's on display on this album is second to none. Now, I'm old enough to remember when The Nightfly was played on the radio. I remember hearing I.G.Y a lot when I was a kid and really loving that song. But it wasn't until I started playing bass and I went back to rediscover the album that I saw that the cast of characters he assembles on this album is like an all-star team. The 5 bass players who play on The Nightfly basically set the standard for all of the recorded bass playing that would happen in the 80s. They're 5 giants, and each one of these bass lines that they play is a masterpiece in and of itself. So I thought I'd make a video today to talk about each one of these 5 amazing bass players, what they were doing during the time that they played on these sessions, what gear they probably used during that session, any experiences that they might have talked about in interviews during the session, but also, my favorite part, I'm going to try to recreate portions of the bass lines on each one of these 8 tracks, and we're going to take a look at what makes them so special. For you gearheads out there, I'm going to be using my Fender Geddy Lee signature jazz bass, which has a badass bridge. I also have a Sadowski preamp in here with all the controls set to 0 so that I can basically just use it to get the buffer and a little bit of gain. And I'm going to plug straight into GarageBand with no EQ and a little bit of compression. I'm going to see if I can match the tone that some of these guys get on these legendary recordings, and we're going to talk about their amazing playing. So, let's get into it. Track number 1, the most recognizable song from the album. Like I said, this was a song that I heard on the radio growing up, and right away we get the great Anthony Jackson on bass. Anthony Jackson, one of the greatest electric bass players in the history of the instrument. A true master and genius at what he did. Sound-wise, he developed a 6-string bass. During this time, he was already one of the most in-demand studio players in New York City. His association with Donald Fagen went back to playing on 1980's Steely Dan record, Gaucho, and around this time he was involved with several projects, including Chaka Khan's What You Gonna Do For Me album, the first Eyewitness album with Steve Kahn, and the very excellent Grover Washington in concert video, which I watched about 1,000 times when I was growing up. For the session, I'm pretty sure that Anthony used his famous Career Girl bass, which was a 75 Fender Jazz with a 73 Fender Precision neck. Of note on this first track is the appearance of Wendell 2. Wendell 2 is a $100,000 drum machine that Donald Fagen and Gary Katz had created for this session. A second generation of a drum machine that they tried to use on Gaucho, but this one sounded better and they had a little more success with it. This was one of the first albums to be recorded digitally. They combined a lot of synthesized bass with real bass, and Wendell 2 with real drummers. And the effect is pretty cool, and it would go on to influence the music going forward in the 80s, 90s, and beyond. Becker and Fagen made Neurosis and Obsession rewarding and uplifting. Endless hours were spent analyzing and refining the smallest performance details without noticeably improving the music. But I must say that the 2 tracks I did for Steely Dan's Gaucho, Glamour Profession and My Rival, and the 2 on The Nightfly, I.G.Y and Ruby Baby, did improve my ability to constructively analyze a performance. Becker and Fagen's constant prodding, combined with their willingness to let me prod myself, even allowing me to destroy a performance they loved because I insisted on redoing the entire part, helped put titanium in my spine. Now let's get to the music. a shuffle, our first of 3 on the album, although this one's in G sharp minor. I love the sound of the keyboards on this one, obviously, and the horn line is unmistakable. So immediately the thing with this bass line that grabs me is his use of space. Anthony is using space incredibly. Space and articulation. Anthony is choosing very decisively what notes are going to be long and what notes are going to be short. And this line is filled with a ton of expression and short notes that you have to really pay attention to nail the feel. Another trademark of Anthony, he doesn't use root 5th movement like most bass players. Most of us learn to use root 5. He's going to shy away from root 5. He's going to give you 7ths a lot. In that first line, he plays the 4. He goes to the 4 of the chord. It's a minor chord. He plays G sharp, F sharp, C sharp. But effective and amazing. Also, you can always count on Anthony Jackson to be very deliberate with his choices. Nothing happens on accident, and that's what makes him so great. That section, I'm pretty sure that the keyboard is playing some extra notes that the bass isn't playing, but you'll have to put on some headphones and check it out for yourself. Here's my approximation of the verse going into that pre-chorus. Last note, in order to try to cop his sound, I tried to play sort of between the 2 pickups. This seems to be the area where Anthony played the most. I rolled off a little bit of high end. I tried to be very short with my attack, but very precise. Not an easy thing to do. Bravo, AJ. One of the greats to ever play the bass. At this point in 1981, he was already studio royalty. He had played with Aretha Franklin. He had done dates for Quincy Jones. He was all over TV and movies. He was very recognizable and established as one of the greats on this very young instrument. Chuck's association with Donald Fagen began through Steely Dan, of course. Starting with Pretzel Logic in 1974, Chuck appeared on 5 straight Steely Dan albums all the way through Gaucho. Unfortunately, Chuck's recollection of the sessions for the Nightfly weren't favorable ones. He didn't really have a great experience without Walter Becker there to be the musical go-between between him and Donald Fagen and Gary Katz. Listen to what he wrote on his website about that experience. After I finally figured out what Donald was trying to write, I showed him how easy it was to write it and asked him why didn't he just hum it like he always had in the past. I also told him he was wasting his time and mine. It was probably the first time I ever confronted him in that way, and he probably didn't like it. Anyway, we got through laying down 2 tracks, and I went back to my hotel and called Gary and complained. Regardless, Chuck turned in one of the great bass performances on this album, and personally my favorite track on the Nightfly. During this time, around 1981, Chuck had relocated to Boulder, Colorado, but was still heavily involved with projects including albums with Ry Cooder and Ricky Lee Jones. I'm pretty sure that he used his very famous 1957 Fender Precision bass that had been modified with a bridge pickup. This is a great track. First thing I noticed right away is the Rhodes and how beautiful that instrument sounds, especially when you have headphones on. Now pay attention, the bass is kind of up in the mix for this one. If you listen really closely, I can hear his fingers on the frets. Now this is trademark Chuck Rainey. The solid bass grooves are amazing. The fills and the other stuff he adds in are incredible. There's a section where they're playing these Ds coming out of the chorus, and he plays that little guitaristic fill to get back into the A sections. It's brilliant. Also, one of my favorite parts of the track is the brilliant fill that he plays at the end, near the ending of the tune, where they're playing the Ds again. That's incredible. Like everything he's on, Chuck gets a brilliant sound on this record, although I'm hearing a little more high end than you hear on those older Steely Dan records. To approximate this, I probably favored my neck pickup about 25% more than the bridge pickup. It was a lot of fun to play this bass line, and Chuck is a genius. Shuffle number 2, also 120 BPM. Common theme on this album. The playing is absolutely mechanical by Anthony Jackson. It's really astonishing how well he plays this song. This is the second track where we hear the Wendell 2 drum machine being combined with a live drummer. And this is a very composed line like I.G.Y, where Anthony doesn't really deviate. Also, ornamentations he's using, very deliberate. This line is precise, it's locked in, and he's using those crazy minor seventh intervals that aren't that easy to play on the bass, but he's just nailing every single one. Again, the long notes versus the short notes really make this groove happen. Check it out. Now, I don't know if it's just me, but I'm pretty sure that bass has a good amount of chorus on it as the song is fading out. It's really cool how the track builds right up to the fake party. Also, Greg Fillinganes is killing this piano solo. The youngest of the 5 bassists on the Nightfly, but one of the most prolific. During this time, Marcus was 22 years old, and he was a hot, young phenom on bass that everyone in New York wanted to play on their albums. He was between 2 albums by David Sanborn called Voyeur and As We Speak, and he had just recorded a debut album with an amazing young studio vocalist named Luther Vandross, an album called Never Too Much. He was also a seasoned studio player at this point, and if that wasn't enough, he finished a 2-year run as the bass player for Saturday Night Live. When he wasn't in the studio making records, he was on the road during this time with Miles Davis. It doesn't get any better than that. Now, I'm almost 100% sure for this session, he played his 1977 Fender Jazz bass. And it sounds beautiful. Now, I think I was 22 at the time. I'd heard a lot about these Steely Dan cats. I'd heard they put musicians through it, making them play songs 20, 30 times to get exactly what they want. People were warning me, just be ready to spend a lot of time in the studio. I came in and Donald played me the song called Maxine. He said, here's the music. I looked at the music and I played the song down 1 time. He said, okay, that's great, man. Can you do 1 more? I said, no problem. I'm ready for the whole journey to begin, the journey of takes. I played it the 2nd time. He said, great, man. Let's move on to the next song. I said, that's it? He said, no, that sounds great.
What that means is either he doesn't like it at all or it works. When I heard the album, I played on maybe 4 or 5 tracks. He actually kept all the tracks, so I was very surprised, very pleased, because it's another standard-setting album, in my opinion.
Marcus wasn't the only bass player in interviews later on to say that he had played on more tracks than we actually hear him on. It doesn't surprise me that Marcus said he played on 4 or 5 tracks and only made it to 3. Many of these bass players probably contributed more than actually ended up on the album. It was just part of Donald Fagen's process. Right away, we can hear that this track is softer in volume and there's way more space being created. I love how the guitar creeps into the sonic space on one side during the second verse. And I will say that Marcus Miller plays the heck out of a 12/8 groove. I've heard him play on several throughout the years, and he kills every single one of them. Part of what makes Marcus's fingerstyle playing so special is that he incorporates all these wonderful slides and high notes to comment on the music. It makes the music so much more colorful and have so much more feeling. He's really a joy to listen to, even if he isn't playing with his thumb. Musically, I picked the section where the outstanding Michael Brecker saxophone solo is, so you can hear how Marcus really adds little things into the part. When he was younger and he was playing on records and he knew that they were going to be huge hits that he was going to hear for the rest of his life, he would often put a little thing in the track that only he knew about, some kind of musical hello to himself years later. I call that the Marcus flex. He's going to put some kind of flex in the track where he's going to show you that he's still an amazing bass player. At this point, he was a 22-year-old kid out to prove to everybody that he was the baddest cat in New York. Check this out. Now this side fades with a beautiful major 7 sharp 11 chord, which is a theme on this album. One of the great session players on the bass in the 80s. If there was a big pop hit coming out of LA in the 1980s, chances are Abe Laboriel was the bass player on it. In 1981-82, he was coming off of projects like Al Jarreau's Breaking Away album, The Dude album by Quincy Jones, projects by Aretha Franklin and Dolly Parton, and he was about to cut Lionel Richie's breakthrough album, Can't Slow Down. Abe was brought into the mix by longtime Steely Dan session drummer Jeff Porcaro. Listen to his story about the session.
Eventually, they play the song for me, and I start playing. They ask if I can come up with anything else. I do something different, and they say, yes, let's do that for the whole song. When I finish, they tell me it sounds monotonous. I could not believe it. So pretty soon I played what would become the final part, and they said, let's record that. We did it in 3.5 hours. Jeff Porcaro told me he had never seen them do anything that fast.
I'm pretty sure that Abe cut this track with the bass that he used for most of his legendary sessions. The Goya bass was pretty much Spain's version of the Fender Jaguar. It was a smaller instrument with a shorter scale, a lighter body, and a series of switches to go between the pickups. It had a thinner sound to it, but it was a sound that engineers could easily add low end to. So Abe used it successfully on a lot of amazing records, and it sounds great. Now this one is right at about 124 beats a minute, which seems to be this album's happy place, around 120, between 120 and 125. A lot of grooves happening there. Right away, cowbell, you've been waiting for it. I love it. It really contributes to the sound of this track. And it was perfect to use as my click. Again, the sonic space that's being used on this record, the sonic space that's being used by each bass player is amazing and beautiful. This part is deceptively hard. Out of all these 8 tracks, New Frontier took me the longest to complete. It is much harder than it looks. I challenge you to try to record 2 minutes of this track without making a mistake. This bass line is a story of shorts and longs, and that's the best way to think of it. There's a pattern that's being played, and it's short the first time, and long the second time. That's pretty much the story of the track, so you have to concentrate on nailing the difference between the longs and the shorts each time. And again, the bass is right up in front of the mix. Now, I don't know if it's me, but I feel like we're getting a little bit of his fingernails that's coming in on those low strings, especially on this part. Again, can I say the Rhodes? And on this track, we hear a Rhodes doubling what a piano is playing. That sound comes from heaven, in my opinion. Now here's the question I have with this track. If you listen really carefully, you'll hear that the piano is doubling the bass on this line. But you don't really hear a bass attack on the octaves. It's entirely possible at about 4 minutes and 26 seconds in that he's actually playing this. I've listened to it a ton and I still can't quite figure it out. The piano is definitely playing, but I'm just not so sure the bass is doing the same thing. Do you have an opinion? Let me know in the comments below. I'd love some help with this one. Now, to try to cop Abe's Goya bass sound was very unlike all of the other tracks where I knew everybody was dealing with a Fender bass. It's fairly easy to get a Fender to do an impression of another Fender, but to do an impression of a Goya Panther bass was a little different. I knew that the sound was going to be thinner, so the first thing I did in the mix was to roll off some of the low end. I know that the Goya basses weren't as bottom heavy as Fenders. Abe is also able to throw in some really cool and exciting little fills to this very disciplined part he plays, especially in the bridge section where he plays a little fill that goes something like this. I really dig that. This one is slower, much funkier, and the whole track sounds like Marcus is flexing. His Fender sounds huge, but clear. He's playing a lot of things that sound like Marcus Miller here to me that have been incorporated into the arrangement, which makes me suspect that he was probably reading minimal information that went back later and got doubled, like this line. This is the thickest sounding of all the tracks on the album because there's so much going on. Larry Carlton also plays a beautiful solo on this track. Pay close attention to the chorus, which you're going to hear here as it happens the first time. Now the cool thing is, When this chorus happens, Marcus adds very, very slight variation to those lines each time, especially the 16th notes. Now the ultimate flex happens on this track. Last chorus, Going Out, Marcus actually plays double stops on the bass. Yes, you heard it here first. He plays double stops. I've never heard anybody do this, but if you listen really closely, this is actually what Marcus is playing. He's doubling the guitar, then doing his own thing. Check it out. How cool is that? Now this track is mixed a little softer, and Greg Feelinganes again plays a killing keyboard solo on the intro and the outro of this tune. Probably my favorite part of this track is how they have the hand drums, the congas, panned really hard left in the sonic spectrum. It's a really cool thing to listen to. Now this one has a really bouncing 2 feel, which means that first beat is going to be a little short and the second beat is going to push a little bit. That's kind of a bouncing 2. Now if there's a Marcus flex happening on this track, it might be when that B over C chord happens every time and Marcus does his very trademark, which jumps right out on the track. On this quiet island in the bay, I remember. This whole record, the bass seems a little more up front than you would hear in a normal record. Also, as each guitar part is added, it's like the story keeps unfolding in the music. By the way, this is also my favorite song that has anything to do with Fidel Castro, and if you haven't read the lyrics, read them. It's pretty dark. Again, one of our MVPs on this track is the Fender Rhodes. What an unbelievable sound. Check out this line that Marcus plays at the end of the track. Coming out of the 70s, Will Lee was the #1 studio session bassist in New York. He was also near the top of the list as a session singer for jingles and TV shows. He was extremely prolific, having played with the Brecker Brothers, Dreams, Carly Simon, and several other projects throughout the 70s. During the time of the recording of the Nightfly, Will was already involved with projects including Irene Cara, Barry Manilow, and he was just about to start a 30-plus year run on television as the bass player with the world's most dangerous band. Now, Will's gear was kind of the hardest to figure out for me. We can see in early pictures from the first few episodes of Late Night with David Letterman that he's playing a white Fender Jazz. It could have been that instrument. He also could have been playing a very modified red Fender Precision that's been outfitted with 2 jazz pickups. I think that instrument might actually be a fretless now, but he used that bass on a lot of session work as well.
I remember utilizing a technique which is the same that Rocco Prescia uses for muting. The thing that I've always tried to do is emulate that upright bass sound that I grew up hearing in my household by doing something with the electric bass that could almost get the feel going. I kind of uber muted for that track. The drum part was so precise that it was easy to get a good feel with it. This was an overdub situation, so I was the only person in the studio at the time for it.
Musically speaking, this is shuffle number 3, and it's also the 3rd appearance of Wendell 2. I would consider this track to be a jazz influence track and not a jazz track in itself. Now that muting technique that Will was talking about is something I'm not really good at doing, but him and Rocco both kind of did a technique where they used their right hand to mute the notes as they played, which involves fretting a note and then using your pinky or other fingers to mute the string as you're playing. I'm not really that great at that, but I do palm mute with my thumb quite a bit, and I think you get a very similar result. So that's the technique I used when I tried to reproduce a section of this track. Now, I'm not sure if Will was reading chord changes and then they went back, transcribed his line and had him double, or it's entirely possible that Will had a specific line to read that everybody was going to play. But regardless, he's pretty buried in this mix. There's a lot of keyboard bass and a lot of left-hand piano that's really covering up what he's doing, but it contributes to the overall sound. Now, the urban legend about this track, which has been confirmed, is that he used 4 piano players to get 2 hands on a keyboard. He was not happy with how any of the pianists phrased their left hand with the walking bass line and the right hand on the offbeats. He couldn't get what he wanted, so he had 4 guys track, and he mixed up their 2 hands. He tried one guy's left hand with another guy's right hand. It took him 4 guys to get the part he wanted for the piano and that staggered kind of walking bass thing that you hear on this track. I've also decided to include the jazzy ending. Some of these chords are typical of how we would end a song, but the rhythm is a little weird. I thought it might be interesting to see what it looked like on paper. And just like the first side of the record, we fade out on the shimmerings of a major 7 sharp 11 chord. Beautiful. So that's the album. If you're not intimately familiar with the Nightfly, I highly recommend going and picking it up. Even if you're not a bass player, it's one of the great albums in my opinion. Sonically, it's hard to name an album that sounds as good. The music is fantastic, the playing is at the highest level, and it's just a joy to listen to. So if you've got 40 minutes, put on some headphones and listen to the whole album from front to back. You won't regret it. It's a beautiful piece of work. Now, if you're a bass player, there's a lot of information to chew on here. Sit down with the album and see if you can figure out some of these amazing grooves. And if you like the bass players that you hear, go and find as many records as you can that those guys play on, because there's a lot more where that came from. I'd like to thank one of my high school students, I.G.Y Reyes, for giving me the idea to put this episode together. Like I said, I've always been a huge fan of the album The Nightfly, but when he came back from summer break and all he had been listening to was Donald Fagen, it seemed like an inevitability. So I.G.Y, I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you guys enjoyed I.G.Y taking us out on Green Flower Street. Did you learn something new about the Nightfly today? Do you want to comment on something you saw in the video? Did you like it? Please give a thumbs up if you did. And if you'd like to hear more original jazz bass centric content coming at you every single week, please click that subscribe button and you won't miss a video. As always, thank you for watching, take care of yourself, and please Love your neighbor.